Wrong.
No. I demand a recount.
Actually, I have a very different interpretation of that.
How do you define verb? So what have you got?
Yeah, this is like
Barry in
super.
the face.
It's a little too intense.
What if he wants to move
Is it
around?
too intense?
You've got to move back a bit, surely.
Well, it's not as close as you think it is.
Not as close as you think?
No.
Fascinating.
Take a look. That's how far it is.
Thanks, David.
Because it's the wide angle of the lens. It doesn't actually. How close it is physically doesn't reflect what you end up getting.
I was going to say, what's that thing? Of course, the answer is this.
Yes.
That's not.
Sure, you're fine. I don't know why I laughed so hard. Sorry. No, that was like, no, but don't. No, I just want to make you laugh.
Very.
You all set?
Almost. I didn't think we'd have to move all the tables around.
Sorry.
No,
It's
it's
my
not you.
fault. It is
It's
my
not you.
fault.
It's not
It is
you.
my fault. It is my fault.
It should have been empty out, but whoever had the art display here left all their stuff here, and I don't like damaging
It is,
it.
it is not my. It is the art display person's fault. You know who is that?
It's all of Procom.
Thanks,
There we
Coco.
go.
We should kick it old school. We don't have to wait on people.
Yeah, we're waiting on technology, don't we?
Yeah, that's what I mean.
I was saying.
You get me?
We wouldn't wait for people, but we do wait for the internet. It's
Yeah,
important.
that was kind of the joke that I
I
was
see.
trying
Okay.
to run, yes.
Well, Carolyn
Okay,
Kane
so-
really wanted to attend, so I had to make sure.
Yeah, I can see that now. But it's too late.
It is too late.
All right, we're live.
The moment passed.
Okay, we're ready to start. Hello, everybody. I'm David Gauntlet, so I'm introducing and chairing this, though I don't know if it'll take much chairing because it's an interactive session. You're welcome to shout out at any time, Ben says. We're delighted to have, of course, Ben Barry. You're all familiar with Ben. Woo! Chair of the School of Fashion, who's going to consider the question, answer the question. Can fashion end toxic masculinity? A question which invites the very obvious answer, no. Toxic masculinity is awful and deeply embedded in society, as is well known. How can fashion end that? That's exciting. That's why we're all here. We're going to find out the actual answer to that question. So that's good. In fact, I thought the answer was no, and then he took off his coat, and it's like, yes, maybe it can, through the power of that one top alone. But if it needs any more things, then you're going to have to tell us what you got there. So thank you, Ben.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. I know it's a snowy Thursday, so I really appreciate everyone's here. And if anything, I think this, hopefully I'll talk a little bit and we can have a conversation about this. I do want to acknowledge that, I don't think this was planned, but I think it's really appropriate that today is the day of remembrance and action on violence against women. And obviously toxic masculinity, hegemonic masculinity are a big part of that. And so I think it's fitting that this talk is today. Let's see if I can get this to work. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I want to begin by reading three really kind of free verse poems. I wrote them in under 5 minutes with my MA Fashion Research Methods class last year when we went to the University of Guelph to do a digital storytelling workshop. And so as I read these, I just want you to look at these photos and just kind of reflect on the words. Free, playful, happy, uninhibited, joyful, authentic. Looking back at these photos of me, that's how I see myself. I didn't know the power of surveillance. I didn't know the power of self-surveillance. I didn't know the power of gender norms. 4 yellow necklaces, all of different shades, hung down my neck to my knees. They jingled together as I danced about my grandmother's kitchen. As I twirled around and around, my necklaces moved with me, moved with my body. They caught the air, flung out, and danced alongside me. 4 yellow necklaces became part of me, until they were taken away. The smoothness of the silk hugged my hands as I pulled my gloves on. My fingers hit the ends, and I felt transformed. No longer was I building Lego or dipping carrots into melted cheese. Now I was queen of my grandmother's house, and my hands led the way. Graceful, delicate, and fierce. And then I took off my gloves. So I'd spent my PhD looking at women's body image, women's relationship to fashion. And then when I got to Ryerson, I started to think pretty deeply about how I was impacted by the fashion industry and how other men who are like me, who are different from me, were also impacted by fashion. And so part of this research has been locating myself and thinking about myself within it, but obviously not centering myself within the work. And so this research really comes out of a 3-year project that was funded by an Insight Development grant from SSHRC that explored the relationship between men, masculinity, and fashion. And certainly I always thought exploring masculinity and toxic masculinity would be really important, but I think it's particularly important right now when we think about the political climate we live in, right? We have men who are leaders of parties, leaders of countries, leaders of provinces that are really asserting dominance in ways that harm other people. And I think when we think of fashion, well, why is fashion a tool to think through this, right? Why is a fashion could be a tool to undo this, right? It might seem very trivial, especially if you're not studying fashion, if this isn't your focus. I mean, in many ways, I think that's just how fashion has been gendered, and that speaks more to how we've gendered fashion than the power of fashion itself. But really, fashion is how we learn about gender. Fashion is how we construct gender. And fashion, in many ways, is how we interpret the gender of others. And so this project centered fashion to look at how men experience, embody, and reimagine masculinity through their everyday fashion practices. And the project included over 50 men who ranged in age and sexuality, job, class, body type, clothing style. And I engaged them in sort of 2 different ways. One was wardrobe interviews. So actually going into their homes, looking at their clothes, and asking them to talk about what hung in their closet, when they wore it, what it meant to them, when they didn't wear it, and why. And the second part was an arts-based approach, where these men took part in fashion photo shoots. They took part in a fashion show that I'll talk a little bit about, in order to explore how they really lived masculinity through fashion, how it moved on their body, and to use these tools of fashion and almost subvert them, to create new understandings of fashion through its very tools. Now, I know that there are some people in this room who study fashion, so you don't need a 101 on fashion, but for those of you that are like, I've never studied fashion before, what exactly is fashion? I wanted to talk about the way I kind of think about fashion. And I pulled this from a scholar named Sophie Woodward, who defines fashion in 3 ways. So first, we think of fashion as a noun. Fashion as this industry or system. It's probably the most common interpretation of fashion, from production to design to marketing to retail. This system that's responsible for this annual or seasonal change in silhouette, in fabric, in shape. We often think of the fashion designer like Virgil, the artistic director for Louis Vuitton menswear, Off-White, as sort of the center of the fashion system. And obviously when we think of the fashion system in gender, the fashion system imbues by clothing, fabrics, cuts, with ideas of masculinity and femininity, creates clothes that are suitable for men and women, right? The fashion system is responsible in many ways for this binary. The second way to think about fashion is through this idea of fashionable. Fashionable as an adjective. So this is really clothing of the moment. It changes according to time and place, but it certainly is what comes down the runway, what's perpetuated as the style of that season, that maybe 5 decades as it takes shape, but it's always changing. This is work from Craig Green, who plays on like the uniform and utility concepts. And in men's fashion, often what's fashionable plays on different tropes of masculinity. The last way to think of fashion is fashioning as a verb. Right, something that most of us do every day. Well, we all do every day when we open our wardrobe and we decide what to wear. Right, fashion in this case is an activity. It's a social practice. We assemble clothes, we edit them, and we wear them. And that allows us, right, in many ways, right, to sort of follow what the industry says, but also to challenge the industry and reimagine how we put clothes together to create new understandings of gender and identity. And obviously these concepts are very much entangled, influence each other, as I'll talk a little bit about. But this is just how I start to think about fashion, and certainly within the context of this project. Thinking of both fashion as an everyday practice, but also as fashion as this much larger system. So menswear has seen almost really this revolution in the early 21st century. And there's been three main shifts. And I think this is pretty significant because menswear, particularly compared to women's wear, has changed much, much slower. And these changes, we can first think about them through the introduction of the skinny silhouette. So with Raf Simons, with Hedi Slimane around 2001, this really slim silhouette became the dominant fit in menswear. And it started on the runway, moved to other designers, but also to mainstream. And this really marked a pretty dramatic change from much bigger, boxier silhouettes that were in the 80s and 90s. If we look at what's on the runway now, we're kind of seeing it reverting back to much kind of looser, wider, bigger silhouettes. But this, for almost a decade and a half, became the dominant fit in menswear. The other major shift was who was actually wearing these clothes on the runway. So there was this new form of male embodiment, really a thin, tall, primarily white, always non-disabled male model. The media, scholars have used words like feminine and androgynous to describe the body type, but again, a pretty dramatic shift from much more of this kind of muscular silhouette that we saw in the 80s and 90s. The last change we've seen is sort of this movement towards men's self-representation of their bodies. So in the 80s and 90s, fashion really pioneered this mainstream objectification of the male body, and primarily through fashion photography and fashion magazines. In the early 21st century, men are now the creators and the producers of their own images, right? Through social media, through smartphones, they're increasingly documenting their own bodies, their own clothing, and sharing that with the world. And so these are really three pretty dramatic changes that we've seen. And at the center of all of these changes is obviously the male body, right? The male body in terms of how it's created by clothing, the actual embodiment and shape of the body, and then how the body is being represented. Now, it's not that men's fashion has never shifted, right? We have seen men's fashion shift, and often in this pendulum. So we've gone from sort of this drab, ubiquitous kind of gray flannel suit in the 40s and 50s to the Peacock Revolution, where what was fashionable at this time was obviously something that was much more body conscious, colorful, lush fabrics, going back in the 80s and 90s to a silhouette that really emphasized tropes of masculinity. So kind of suits that were really wide-shouldered, showing captains of industries, oversized sportswear, again showing the bulkiness of the male body. So this has always shifted. And we can kind of think of men's fashion as doing three things. Shifting from unmarking, marking, and remarking the body. So in many ways, it unmarked the body if clothing reflects dominant ideas of masculinity, what's fashionable at that time. It marks the body if it challenges these dominant ideals. And then it remarks by constantly shifting, whether that's shifting over decades or whether that's men just shifting their wardrobe every day as an everyday practice. But these three shifts that I talked about are particularly significant when we think of masculinity and this idea of toxic masculinity, or what scholars call hegemonic masculinity. Now, masculinity is not actually something that describes an actual flesh, blood man. Masculinity is a practice. So it's something we do every day in action. And toxic masculinity, then, is the most exalted form of masculinity. And it's a practice that reinforces division between men and women and between men. And it values power and dominance and reinforces patriarchy. So this is what toxic masculinity is all about. And despite shifts in how men do masculinity based on their age and their race and their class and their job, the central foundation of masculinity is that it's not feminine. It's the antithesis of femininity. And that's what's always grounded this concept of masculinity, particularly toxic masculinity. So then this plays a pretty big role when we think of fashion, right? Fashion is something that in modern Western society that's been gendered as feminine. Now, of course, this wasn't always the case. Fashion was associated with men. Scholars kind of debate when, but this is often before the French Revolution and then what was called the Great Masculine Renunciation, where men were defined in opposition to flamboyance, to extravagance, to fashion, and sort of this drab silhouette became, and drab look became what was associated with how men dressed. And so in many ways, modern men's dress has then been defined about what styles to avoid, to repress, and men have enacted toxic masculinity by wearing clothes that don't draw attention to the body. In fact, in many ways, this idea of toxic masculinity is even about the antithesis of the body, right? Because if we're attending to the body, that shows vulnerability, sensuality, which is gendered as pretty dangerously feminine in Western society. Now, there's been debate about what these changes in menswear in the 21st century have done to masculinity. And there's a series of scholars who say, actually, these three changes I described have completely destabilized toxic masculinity. And there's this new movement of inclusive masculinity, masculinity that embraces femininity, embraces queerness, and performances and practices associated with both of these. The idea that these slim bodies challenge the previous muscular representations that are associated with dominance, that these thin bodies give visibility to men who were previously marginalized from the fashion industry. And even this slim fit clothing trend that reveals the body suggests a more sensual, a more caring type of male embodiment and masculinity. And so for many scholars, we see that they argue that the fashion industry and what's been deemed as fashionable is actually shifting the ways in which we're doing masculinity through fashion. And so part of what I was really interested in exploring is this something we're seeing in everyday life? When we look at the fashioning, how are men buying clothes, putting clothes together, wearing clothes in everyday life? And so this takes me to the wardrobe interviews, where I actually had the chance to go into men's wardrobes and ask them about what they wore. And overall, I found that there were maybe three main practices, three main ways men did masculinity through fashion. And I want to talk a little bit about them. But certainly the idea was that all men I interviewed, regardless of age, race, job, class, were engaging in some type of fashion practice that would have been gendered feminine. And the ways they were doing that was quite interesting. So the first group of men, from their wardrobes in and of themselves, you wouldn't think that they would be interested in fashion. Their clothing was dark. It followed very traditional sort of masculine silhouettes, dark blazers, pants, button-down shirts. These were primarily men that had professional identities. They were upper middle class. They were leaders in their field. But nevertheless, they did embrace these feminine performances. So one man who was an elected official, he would regularly go out for an evening to a menswear boutique and spend hours picking fabric, being measured for a suit, picking complementary accessories, right? This idea of vanity or focusing on the body and appearance that we wouldn't associate with masculinity was very important to him. In fact, he knew about the cuts of suits, how they were made, and had a sketchbook where he would actually design the suits he wanted. And he would bring that in and show them, this is what my vision is. So we would never normally, right, associate this with masculinity. And this man's clothes from the materials didn't look like he was engaging in any type of disruption. But that practice, although it had, it was associated with a lot of class status, was certainly challenging some binaries. But then there was time when I was talking to this man and many other people in this group, the way in which they described their fashion practices recoded any notions of femininity with masculinity. So I'll give you an example. So talking about the importance of suits in his life, this man explained, courts, parliaments, business rooms are modern-day battlefields where we have to win or lose. And this is the uniform for that place where we have those battles. And so it's the clothing you wear to go into battles. Suits to me are like suits of armor. I feel like putting on a suit is like putting on a suit of armor. So I feel I'm ready to go to battle. I'm ready for the fight. Right? So this is sort of really explaining his engagement with fashion, or justifying his engagement with fashion by connecting it to these ideals of dominant or toxic masculinity. Even describing how much he loved his tuxedo, he immediately connected that to this masculine archetype of James Bond. And he says, I love having my James Bond moment, where I can just break out my tux and go to an event. For me, wearing a tux is the ultimate power. So again, a lot of these themes that have been associated with toxic masculinity are recoding traditional feminine practices to explain this engagement with fashion. The second group of men subtly integrated women's clothes or feminine styles into their clothing and into their overall look. So these men really embraced the current trends towards vivid colors, lush accessories, fitted silhouettes. They often worked in spaces or were engaged in social contexts that were characterized by more feminine performances. So one man, for example, was a product designer. And he liked to balance masculine and feminine pieces, but he always wanted to ensure that his overall outfit had a masculine look. So his masculine pieces would counterbalance or offset his feminine pieces. So he said, I'll go into a women's section and I'll pick out accessories because I think there's a way to incorporate that into my style as a man and still look masculine. So he'd often pair jewelry with sportswear or with military-inspired clothing. And he'd find ways to pair these two pieces or these different pieces together. But sort of digging deeper at these practices, I found that this group of men was more likely to strategically borrow feminine pieces and wear them in particular contexts, and particularly contexts in which they needed to mobilize femininity or women's styles in ways that would provide certain benefits. So many of these men did wear feminine pieces, but within moderation. And so, for example, for many men in this group, for example, the man I just talked about, the product designer, he would remove his jewelry when he was meeting with his company's management or when he was giving a presentation to them. He was worried that any signs of femininity could distract from his expertise and could influence how his management was interpreting what he was saying. And this had the same case for many other men who would change their outfit. If they were in the suburbs, they would wear something that was more associated with masculinity. If they were in the city, they would feel more comfortable to wear something associated with femininity. And some men who also worked in professions that were associated with femininity would actually wear or play up their feminine clothing in order to receive benefits. So, for example, a museum curator would play up his femininity in particular meetings. And he said, if I'm meeting with the mayor, I'll push it because she loves statement clothing. If it's the commissioner, I'll wear a bow tie and a pink shirt because he thinks that's my signature. And so the way in which these men would either switch their outfits or play up certain outfits in certain contexts showed that there was this gender privilege in how they mobilized women or feminine styles. Now, the last group of men did masculinity by openly celebrating feminine's dress. These men wore clothes from women's sections, from men's sections. They put them together in really disruptive ways. These men were mostly freelance artists, performers, makeup artists. They were predominantly gay and queer, but some identified as straight. So I'll give you an example. So one man who was a massage therapist and an actor, he would regularly wear women's skirts. And he explained after a breakup with a previous girlfriend, he really wanted to find himself, redo his closet to find clothes that represented him. And he tried on a skirt and he just thought it felt right. He said, it felt like when you have a sunburn. You don't know how much it hurts until you put aloe vera cream on and you're like, oh my God, that feels good. That's how the skirt felt on me. So this man mixes women's skirts with conventional men's attire, a pencil skirt with a button-down shirt, and Oxford shoes. But there were still times for this man and other men in this group where they felt they couldn't fully embrace women's or feminine clothes. And so for this man, he talked about what to wear when he would go on a date. And while I was interviewing him, he had a date a few days later. And he said to me, "I'm going on a date on Wednesday with this girl. If I wear a skirt, it's showing I have a lot of femininity. Is she going to be turned off by that? Is she going to want to come home with me?" So he decided, after all, I followed up that he was going to wear pants to comply with the gender expectations of that heterosexual date. And so other men would do this strategically if they had a business meeting, say with investors that were going to fund a performance or a show. They were worried that if they dressed, if they dressed in women's clothes or something that was too feminine, it could have negative impacts. And so they would often tone it down. Again, they didn't completely give up what they were wearing, but they might put on a dark blazer over their leopard print top. And men also did this in everyday life to prevent hostile encounters. One man said, he explained if he's going to the library or a grocery store, how he would tone down his clothes. He said, "People are just there to get their groceries or to go to the library. So when they come smack up against a wall of sequins or a floor length of leopard print, it can be jarring, but not in a good way." And so whether there was social benefit, whether it was to offset discrimination, these men, according to context, would change their clothes. There we go. And so what I found in many ways that participants varied. They had various degrees of gender privilege, but all of these men evaluated their schedules for the day ahead and decided what combinations of clothing best conform to the gender expectations of their contexts. Many of these men were aware that engaging with fashion, whether it was as a practice through shopping, whether it was through wearing clothing that was associated with women and femininity, would have negative effects. It would put them personally and professionally at risk in certain ways. And so in many ways, they made strategic decisions to reinforce masculinity, and in many ways, toxic masculinity. But of course, it's important to recognize that, these men are not just putting clothing on uniform bodies. They're putting clothing on their individual bodies, and bodies, like clothing, have been constructed according to discourses and structures of power. And so one of the things that became very obvious in this research is that men whose bodies are marginalized by fashion challenge the system that denies them humanity and style by wearing clothing that reflects their identities and in some ways allows them to subvert dominant notions of masculinity. And I think we need to, again, think of this in this larger context of the fashion industry and these body ideals. In many ways, we are seeing new masculine styles through fashion, through what's fashionable. We're seeing more images of men on social media. But in fashion imagery, we're still primarily seeing lean, tall, young, white, non-disabled men. And we are still seeing some muscular men, these bodies that were very popular in the 80s and 90s, in underwear ads, in commercial fashion advertising. And so in many ways, we have two male body ideals that now take up this hegemonic or dominant position. Either this muscular young white man or this thin young white man. And these are the two ideals. And so in many ways, there's still this dominance of body ideals within the fashion industry. And we have two body ideals that have this hegemonic status. And in much of the research talking around body image, many of the men who were lean or muscular could easily find clothes off the rack, took pleasure displaying their bodies, their garments on social media, but men who did not didn't enjoy these same privileges. And so obviously the thin ideal helps some men who were previously excluded feel empowered through fashion, feel visible in fashion, but it also marginalizes and further marginalizes older men, fat men, disabled men, racialized men from engaging in fashion and from the industry. And so for many of these men, by engaging in fashion, they're actually disrupting toxic masculinity. And I'm going to explain what this means. So for example, men who were racialized, who are trans, and wore suits in particular context, challenged this white middle class heteronormative idea of masculinity, particularly in places of work. And if we go back to one of the participants, he wears a suit in order to undermine its associations with white privilege and as a way to challenge racism. And he says, for him, a suit disarms people who otherwise might seek to be rude to me. I should say this man is also Sikh, and he wears a turban. And he says, a suit disarms people who otherwise might seek to be rude to me or treat me inappropriately. It pushes the balance. Like, I don't know if I should push him. Maybe he'll sue me or something. Maybe he's a fancy lawyer. So it throws people off the balance. Otherwise, you would just look at that person and go, okay, they're a turban person. They're a bearded person. I'm just gonna be rude to them or treat them in a certain way or have a certain stereotype about them. But the way I dress, the way I do it kind of offsets it. And so obviously there's still class privilege, but in many ways this man recognized that, right, wearing a suit unsettles stereotypes, challenges power structures, and simply as a brown turban man wearing this suit was disruptive. And many of this worked similarly for a lot of the trans participants I interviewed as well. For many of the participants who were fat, right, the ways they engaged with fashion challenged ideas of this dominant masculinity. So we have seen this movement in fashion towards embracing size inclusion, creating clothes for fat bodies. But often these clothes, the goal of them is to hide or disguise fatness, or to make the body appear thin. So it still reaffirms this thin ideal that the clothes should thin a body or slenderize a body in a particular way, that fatness shouldn't be celebrated and shouldn't be shown. And so for one of my participants, he really wanted to disrupt this and show off his fat body. And so he loved buying secondhand clothing. And so one of his favorite pieces, he bought a Hooters sweatshirt. And he took it home, it was pink, he cut off the bottom to make it into a crop top. And he said, big guys in crop tops is a big fuck you to the world. I'm the least intentional person to wear this. This clothing item is meant for everyone except me. It's particularly for women, particularly in a way that we sexualize women. It's meant for thin women. It's meant for showing that one area of the body that's the hardest to fit into standards. And I'm none of these things. I'm not a sexy woman. I don't have a tiny stomach. I'm not showing off my abs. And so he's proclaiming his fat, hairy stomach in this crop top. And in many ways, he's resisting this assumption that fat bodies should be concealed. And similarly for men who were fat and wore sequins and sparkles and loud colors, they used this lavish, luxurious material as a way to proclaim their body pride and take the association of those fabrics and show that that's how they felt with their body. And in many ways, then that challenged the ways in which fat has been associated, the negative perceptions of fat that have been transferred onto people by wearing sparkles and lame. That challenges that all bodies should be celebrated. Another example of men who really were disrupting these narrow ideals of masculine dominance and toxic masculinity were disabled men in this study. For decades, disabled people have a legacy of being stripped of their fashion autonomy in institutions. So they've been forced to wear uniform, interchangeable outfits that can easily be cleaned and transferred between people. And this still occurs today. And obviously these outfits erase any unique expression of identity and appreciation of disabled bodies. And so for one of the participants in the study, he actively wore color. And he says, color expresses that I like to play, I like to be loud, I like to be goofy. If disabled people are wearing bland, boring, brown stuff that their attendant clearly picked out for them, it doesn't pop. This is agency over my body with these colors. I'm wearing this color and I'm owning what I'm wearing. Look at me. And so he's disrupting really this idea that being non-disabled, this idea of compulsory able-bodiedness is preferable in what everyone is aiming for. He's showing the disabled bodies and that are desirable, and that he takes pride in his body. The second example from the same participant is he loves to wear harnesses, and particularly when he's queer and when he goes to gay clubs. And this is a way to challenge the lack of the fact that disability has been associated with being asexual, being desexualized in many ways, that disability has been defined as defects, and as such, lacking sexual potency, the capacity for sexual feeling, even being associated with having an overall undesirable aesthetic. And of course, disabled people's assumed asexuality isn't a natural consequence of having a disability, but it's rather the result of the way it's of a desexualizing process, the way that culture, and fashion in particular, has pictured disabled bodies. And so this participant would often wear harnesses as a way to sexualize his bodies within gay clubs. And he says, through the harness, I can say, I'm a sexual being. Sexualize me. I'm invisible in queer communities. But my body has value. I don't feel at times my body has value because I have to constantly push to be sexualized, push to be objectified, push to be noticed in the club. So I want to challenge that and show a disabled body is desirable. And so for many of my participants who are older, participants who are fat, participants who are disabled, who actively engaged with fashion, they were challenging these narrow body ideals that the fashion industry promotes as being the definition of masculinity and as creating hierarchies and separation between men. And so having interviewed all of these men individually and hearing their different stories, part of my own thinking as a researcher was, how can we bring them together? How can we create conversation around masculinity, around all of their different clothing, in a space that helps everyone learn from each other? And so one aspect of this project was to use this fashion show, and not a fashion show in terms of selling this new idea of what's fashionable, but still selling a narrative, but a narrative about what is masculinity. And the goal was to create dialogue, and not just dialogue for the audience, although that was a big part. That was what I went into the show originally thinking. But I think really what was most valuable was the conversations that happened backstage between the participants. These participants, right, selected their own clothing from their wardrobes. They helped make creative decisions for the fashion show to express their views of masculinity. And for many of these men, they didn't have the vocabulary to talk about toxic masculinity or fashion, because the first is pretty powerfully invisible, and the second has been gendered feminine. But these participants, and particularly for many of the participants who dressed unconventionally, many of them would never dress this way in front of other men that dressed more conventionally or wouldn't be in those same spaces for fear of harassment or even violence. But backstage, all of these men were able to come together and have conversations. And I think in many ways, these types of conversations bringing such diverse groups of men together otherwise wouldn't happen. And so I wanted just to play a short reel from the show to give you a sense of the diversity of people in it and what it actually was like.
When was it held?
It was held in May 2016.
I've always felt immune to the male ideal in fashion because I never fit in to begin with. I looked at images presented to me like, I could be this kind of guy or that kind of guy, but none of them are going to work because I don't belong to any of these categories. I just never fit in. I knew I could never emulate these archetypes. So I did feel kind of sad, but at the same time, there was this moment where something snapped and I was like, oh my god, you're free to do whatever the fuck you want because who cares? You're not aspiring to an ideal and the limitations were suddenly gone.
When I think about my style, I think about this concept of gender more. Gender more as opposed to genderless. When I thought of the genderless wardrobe, it felt very stripped down, very bleak, very bald, not communicating joy in life and happiness. In terms of syntax, genderless means you're stripping something away. But if you're empowered enough to take on both sets of gender codes, then you have more, and so the idea of the gender more was something that I was really excited about taking on.
Fashion can be like changing to a Superman outfit. You go from this really shy, insecure, scared person to this fashion glamazon, right? It gives me this boost of energy and confidence that I can do anything. I'm sure there are people who have seen me and say, maybe this guy shouldn't be wearing the bright pink shirt because he's a fat guy. But when I got the bright pink shirt on, I got this heightened sense of confidence that I think, I don't care, I'm invincible.
So throughout, let's see. There we go. So the quotes you heard throughout the show, we had the men sort of approve quotes that they came into Ryerson and they recorded, and so we mixed in the quotes to music from their interviews as a way to sort of give voice to their experience of fashion and masculinity. And so a lot of this sort of thinking about can fashion end toxic masculinity and how men are changing outfits and in many ways upholding gender privilege brought me back to myself and really made me reflexive of my own wardrobe choices and recognizing that in many ways I'm no different. I also in many ways uphold ideas of toxic masculinity through the clothes I pick and when I choose to wear what. Right, I was in the fashion show to try to be part of the experience, and the fashion show, like a fashion department, is a safe space for me to play with fashion. And I think in many ways it's also a space where I'm very protected by having a career in fashion and in the fashion department to play with clothing that's not conventionally associated with masculinity. And not only am I protected, I think in many ways maybe these looks enhance my career. I mobilize femininity, as I said some of my participants do, because in fashion it's expected to have original, creative, unconventional looks, and that can in many ways enhance my own status within the field. And obviously my own experience are also cloaked in my own body privilege that's protected me from more marginalization and assault based on what I'm wearing. And so in many ways, I've started to think about what I choose to wear and when. And can I wear more flamboyant and fabulous pieces that I would wear at school in spaces that are uncommon? So obviously I could wear something like this when I'm giving a talk. But what about when I'm walking my dog? And that in many ways I've started to think through this, that by dressing my body in clothes associated with femininity in spaces where these outfits are not the norm, can help maybe unsettle assumptions and inspire unspoken conversations about masculinity. Because I think ending toxic masculinity requires men like me to be mindful of the multiple and often conflicting consequences of our actions and to use our privilege to change inequalities rather than to fortify them. And obviously, we're not alone, right? The industry plays a big role. The design of clothing and media needs to push beyond exclusionary and isolated binaries and ideals. But I do think that everyday actions can ignite change. Indeed, it's everyday actions that have ignited almost all structural change and social transformation throughout history. And I think what this project has taught me and what I've seen for many of the men I've interviewed is that change can begin when we open our wardrobes every morning. Thanks.
Well, that was fantastic. Thank you very much, Ben.
Thanks.
Comments, questions, thoughts, anything?
I love how it's the little things. Are they every day opening your closet? They can affect change. I think that that's the most powerful part I took from your talk. That it's every day.
Yeah. Yeah, I think often we don't think, like, I think we think of fashion as like this big industry, and there's certainly like, right, it's part of it. But the ways in which we're engaging with it and the ways in which obviously everyday practice can also resist what we're being told.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I really enjoyed your talk, one, and two, I used to teach this consumer culture class, and I would always tell my male students at a certain point to go into wherever they shop and look at the color palettes that they have to choose from, and then look at the color palette that women get to choose from. Mm-hmm. And one student did that, and he was shocked. He was like, I have white, black, brown, blue. That's pretty much the men's section at wherever they went. And so I just wondered, in doing all this, if you can talk more about color. If they talked a lot about color.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like first I'll talk about like...
Or even all the things, like the color texture elements.
Well, I think this idea, right, we think of like, oh, we open our wardrobe and it's sort of, I guess, to bring the questions together, and we have choice of what to wear. Well, obviously we don't really have choice, because obviously that choice is dictated by many different things, one of them often being what's available in a men's section, and how the industry is defined, obviously by body, by class, by all of these different things. So that choice is really not choice for most people. What was interesting for a lot of the men who decided that they were going to step across the aisle and go into the women's section, and what that experience was like. And that for many of them, queer, gay, straight, that was really about sort of peering over and seeing like, there are so many other colors, or I can't find jeans that fit, or I want stretchy denim and all men's denim are so hard. And actually the Forever 21 denim like are way more comfortable and they're cheaper. And so it was kind of this experimental trial and error that actually caused many men to move sort of across to the women's section. And it wasn't specifically about disrupting gender. It was about finding clothes that fit their body, having colors that they felt reflected them, and actually intentionally resisting what the industry told them they had to wear. And obviously for many other participants, the idea that you would cross like the section was not even on their mind. This is what was presented to me, and so I'm working with this. And obviously for men that had often the class status, that's when they turned to bespoke. And we're able to actually have clothing that was customized, right? And be like, oh, I want this detail, or I want this lining, or I actually want like this great pattern that I can't find, but I can have made just for me. And so there were ways men sort of really navigated the industry, like what mass industry sells, but often it was like it's dictated by certain things. That's not obviously choice.
Yeah.
Did you come across any ageism
from
the participants, and did they, as they aged, did they move more towards being more open, or vice versa, or did they?
Yeah. I think I found sort of like two main things. I think some men, it was almost a binary in that sense. It was almost like some men felt that as they aged, they had to dress more, in some ways tone it down, because that was appropriate, and particularly to navigate professional context or social context, right? It's not that they didn't want to wear something that was really fabulous. It's that they knew someone would make a comment that like, like, aren't you a bit old for that? Or should you? And they're like, well, I don't want to experience that at work. So maybe in this context, I'll tone it down. But for a party with my friends, I'm going to amp it up. And there were other men who were just, you know what? I'm going to wear exactly what I want to wear. But they often were in a context that valued that more. Yeah.
So one of the things that I found interesting about your talk is the notion of fear, of confrontation, and fear of being judged. And I find that as a dad who has a 11-year-old girl, we're having these conversations about dressing appropriately and not dressing appropriately for fear of confrontation. And she's an art kid who's surrounded by sports-minded kids, and sometimes she feels alienated because she'll wear something that isn't of the norm. Do you find that that's something that, I just found that was interesting.
Yeah.
I'm afraid to send the wrong message. I'm afraid to be confronted.
Yeah, I think the fear, right, was like driven by very real risk. And the risk could range, right, from overt like harassment to like violence. And for other men, it was also just about being uncomfortable of what other, right, for men that maybe had never experienced that or weren't like, it was about, in a sense, I think, giving up a sense of privilege, in terms of knowing that what would this do to my career, or what would this do to how I navigate a context if this happened. And so I think it was one or the other, but those fears were driven by very real personal or professional consequences that these men did face. And I mean, I think I saw that how men changed their wardrobe if they were going to a job interview versus not. I mean, it's these little things that obviously we all do. We make strategic decisions with our clothing, but understanding that there's consequences. And the consequences, it's not to say that one is bad or good. They're messy, right? I mean, I'm very reflective. I was at a press conference this morning at Queen's Park to like support Eating Disorder Awareness Week, and I had to give a speech in like support of it. I did not wear this, right? I wore a blazer and like a gray shirt and like my black pants, right? Like I guess like I'm not trying to place judgment on this. I was certainly felt this would not be appropriate in that context. That would maybe take away from my credibility, or that would detract from like the goal of why I was there. So I wanted to wear something where like it wasn't about the clothing, or I wouldn't stand out. So like I think we all, like, these are very messy decisions, but it's more thinking through. I mean, for me, a big part of this project was thinking through the very real consequences of this, both from like a structural kind of gender perspective and also just everyday human consequences of how we live life.
I think it's interesting too how early this starts. Like, as Gabriel, I'm also raising a miniature human being.
Yeah.
My miniature human being's a man, and we've never put gender norms on him. So he, up until recently, would shop anywhere in the store with whatever he wanted. You want a cape? You want to wear a cape? Mommy will make you a cape.
Mm-hmm.
And then just last year, he's now 8, will now only look in the boys section. And then was also very angry at back to school because there was nothing for boys for back to school at half the stores. It was all for girls. And it's ignoring the fact that it was boys as a consumer. And you're right, what's available to boys even at the age of 8.
Yeah, I know.
It's
dramatically limited.
So scary.
Yeah.
Couples are fire trucks. Yes.
Yeah.
And in many ways, right, it's like, how do you like enforce, in fact, like I sort of made this comment about like men recoding like feminine practices to masculinity. But like, I'm sure for, it starts at like 5 years old when you go to clothes and what graphics or what sayings are on little boys' clothing, right? Those tropes are reinforced that like, that's how it's
I returned a Spider-Man sequin shirt. I was like, I bought it. I'm like, Spider-Man is amazing. And then we had the conversation with my wife. It's like, it's okay when he's at home to wear it, but what if he wears this at school? Like, will he get picked on? Will he get into a fight because he's not wearing something that these other kids can understand? So that idea of fear just reminds me of conversations I have with my daughter about dressing appropriately and not being.
Just to make you feel better about this, at my son's school, and I'm not sure if the gentleman in the video is the same gentleman that's actually the person who I'm talking about, but one of the teachers wears skirts all the time, and it's actually celebrated in the school, and it's part of that, and so
It's a cool school.
it's small, but it's right in the middle of downtown, and it's great because it's not even a thing. It's like, oh yeah, that's just Mr. and he's great, and everybody's like, oh, I can't wait to get Mr. You know what I mean? Like he himself has brought this whole school, and I mean, we have lots of diversity in the school anyway, but he just going in that direction and deciding whether he wanted to do that or not has really enriched the lives of, I think there's 180 students in the school, so it's quite small, but it's definitely changed all of them. And the neighborhood is very much nestled in this village of people who all support the school, and it's very parent-based. It's changed the whole conversation. So it takes just a couple of little ones, you know?
And then what are these spaces and how can we create them, and like often like, but I'm sure like, for example, a lot of participants, right? Like when for example, when some people go to spaces where they can dress like this, right? To get there also requires a navigation. So, right, if I'm gonna, for participants that wore heels, right? They often would not put their heels in a bag, put on runners. I mean, it wasn't for comfort, right? They wanted to strut down that subway platform, but they knew that the looks they would get when they made that sound, when people would look at them if they were going out in the evening or going to work, right? They didn't want to face that, and so they changed. And so it was also how, in many ways, how participants were navigating the city to get to those spaces where they could then do that. That was really interesting. And these are almost like really such tacit things that we don't think about. Like when we make these decisions, and I think that's just what was so interesting about having the clothing there. It could be like, oh, when would you wear that? Oh, and would you wear that to get there? Or how would you, and then you could really start, right, that you wouldn't, I don't think, talk about without these clothing objects in front of you, because you wouldn't even think about it maybe, or it wouldn't come up to me, or it wouldn't come up to them because it was such a routine practice. And so having all of the objects there allowed to have, I think, pretty nuanced conversations about how, like, they're navigating clothing just in a day. Yeah.
I think a lot of people are talking about this younger generation of future men who are having a hard time dressing, and my best friend's son, who's 6, just turned 6. It's a blended family situation, and they are having a very hard time because he's okay with boy clothes, as they call it, but he also wants to put on things that are his sisters, for example, and go to school. And the mom is going and buying him a purse without him asking and handing it to him, saying, I accept him. And yet at school, he's being bullied. And so the dad is having a hard time saying, well, if he picks it, then let him have it. But if he doesn't, why are you handing it to him? Are you setting him up for it? So I think, do you find that in order to have this conversation, it also needs to start, fashion needs to start looking at, the beginning, square one. At what point are kids this fashion is becoming gendered beyond the blue M thing?
Well, Celine Dion launched a kids' clothing line that is apparently like genderless. We'll see what it actually looks like.
Which I personally had a bit of a problem with, because all of a sudden it turned genderless into gray and black and white, and I just thought, why no color? Why no color? Why are we taking color away, and all of a sudden kids can't have rainbows? All they get is some weird star or plus sign, whatever that is.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think genderless clothing often is just masculine clothing, right? That has been, it's still about the disavowal of femininity in many ways, and I think it's more. I think, like, it's not that everyone needs to wear sequins all the day. Like, and that's, if every man wears sequins, we're going to end toxic masculinity. Like, that is definitely not the solution. But I think it's about that there's all of these different styles in which men are dressing. But that some men who dress in ways that really challenge the roots of masculinity, that are embracing femininity, face, right, major risks by doing that. It's such risks, right, that they're covering what they're wearing and they're changing who they are in order to navigate these spaces. But part of the deeper problem is there's not I think, dialogue between these different groups of men, right? These men are not coming together to sort of talk in a way that we can have conversations to understand just these different ways of doing masculinity. And that was sort of, I think, one of the biggest takeaways from this is what are the places and spaces to create these dialogues, because you're really safe if you go to your queer club on Saturday night and you can dress in as many sequins as you want and dance and you're like free, but then you take the subway home and you walk, you know, you face violence, or you go to work the next day and you can't wear that. So it's like, how can you just authentically bring your whole self to your life if everyone's not talking to each other in a way? And so what are the ways to create that dialogue? Yeah.
I'd like to offer a sort of sobering example of how men empower and police each other in dressing. My son works in London in investment banking, and when he started his job as a young banker, I helped him buy his first suits and shoes and whatever, you know, mom's in fashion, she knows what those people wear. And his first week in his job, he was taken aside and told that he must not wear brown shoes. Brown shoes were for polo matches or casual Fridays. And so he had to strip his wardrobe of anything but white shirts and certain kind of tie with stripes. And so when he first told me this, I thought it was absurd, because, like, what's wrong with a light blue shirt? That seems pretty masculine to me. Or brown shoes. But there's a code between these men in power, how they recognize each other. So until we can reach those people, I'm not sure sort of those structures will ever change.
And those people don't allow someone who breaks those rules to come into their ranks. So
Right.
they only allow those
And
who...
he only got away with it that day because he was Canadian and he didn't know, he didn't know any better. So somebody was doing him a kindness. But he's very afraid about what he wears. He's like, can I wear this? It's become quite sad.
Yeah. No, and that's so... Yeah, I mean, I had a participant who was an investment banker, and one day, and he was pretty senior in his career, and one day wore a pretty, like, I think he wore a floral shirt under his suit, and when immediately at a staff meeting, someone's like, oh, only you could get away with that. And the tone in which it was said, how it was said, he's like, I better not wear that again. Yeah. And then he never wore it again. And so, right, these subtle and not so subtle ways that, right, even within a context, we're like, it's a floral shirt or it's brown shoes. I mean, how, right, the way that these red bodies are certainly policed and these norms are upheld.
There's also, I mean, to the conversation, there is a ethnocultural component to this discussion, because I am a person of Caribbean descent, and so often when we have gatherings, we'll actually put a disclaimer that you must wear color. Everyone has to come in something colorful, male or female. And so across the Caribbean, this is in Canada, but even if you go to the Caribbean, men and women, there is no distinction in terms of what would be coded masculine and what would be coded feminine. So a lot of times if you go to the Caribbean, you might see some men walking around and you think, wow, there's a lot of queer people in Barbados, when that's actually not true. It's just a cultural thing where color has no gender, and the expression or the even with certain summer events, the nakedness has no gender. So men will be just as scantily clad as women. And I think what happens in the Western context is that ethnoculturally, you then have a problem, because then you realize, oh, I can't wear, I'm a young Caribbean descended child going to school, I can't wear lime green and white pants to school and brown shoes. Somebody might, right? Whereas I would say that's a really nice outfit. You should wear that to the party that we're having, right? So there's always this cultural clash that happens with color that I think doesn't get brought up because it really is culturally based, not just in terms of retail and all those other things. So I wondered, even in your research, if the cultural aspects of some of your racialized participants, if that came up.
Well, it was huge. I mean, even the idea that what is considered professional dress is this white middle class, like, right, pretty heteronormative, like that is, oh, dress professionally. Well, how's that actually coded? Right, like that's coded, and for many, like especially for it was in direct contrast to like their culture and their background. For many of them, they talked about how especially for their parents who maybe were immigrants, that they had to relearn learn for the first time what professional dress was and what is that, and that challenges how then they would dress. So how they would dress in work was very different from how they would dress if they're going to a social function, to a wedding, for instance, where they would also dress up, and that being dressed up was based on culture and based on context.
Yeah,
but
even my dad. So my dad is in his 70s. My dad has been wearing pink shirts since 1955.
Yeah,
literally. And he didn't know that was a thing. He didn't know that was an issue until somebody pointed out that he was in his 60s. He was I don't really care. But that was interesting to me because that didn't register as something that you just wouldn't do as a man for him, because where he's coming from, everybody's wearing pink or green or lime green and fuchsia or whatever it is, and nobody's really being judged for it. So it's interesting.
There's also that coding though that it's not a skirt in the Caribbean, it's a sarong. And it's not a skirt in Scotland, it's a kilt.
Yeah.
So
Right.
you change the word.
Right, it means
and
something.
now it has,
it's true.
You get a pass, so.
That's true.
Can you talk more about your decision to host the fashion show with Ryerson Athletic Center?
Yeah, it was it was in the new one where Loblaws is. It was the original, so it's the rack, the one in the basement. I wanted the smelly, sweaty, to really be a full sensory experience. I wanted to pick. I wanted to do it on campus, and I wanted to pick a space that was this kind of icon of masculinity, like a gym. But then having all of these men together and performing a fashion show was sort of hopefully incite the audience to question the space and question how we construct masculinity, and particularly by having just not all these different bodies, but all these different types of clothes, right? The men that were really dressing what was authentic to them, and have them in this space where normally men perform this very narrow notion of masculinity and challenging that. So that was part of picking the space, and the fact that it was kind of, and I really wanted to use the weight room, because I really wanted the idea of men walking in with their clothes in between weights, and what all of that symbolized. And then it had just this really beautiful hall that we were using as a runway. Originally I wanted to do it on the track, but the track was not accessible, and trying to build trying to make it accessible was not going to be possible. But no, I'm really I liked the location. I think it worked. Yeah. Yeah, it's a pretty it's a pretty great space. What was also just interesting for me about the space was over the 6 months working with Ryerson Athletics, who managed that space, talking to them about the fashion show, right? It was we're doing this, they were super supportive, but it was an education, I think, on both sides, right? Even having them watch the rehearsals and the setup and see what was going on, and it was I don't know if maybe the group of people here would be involved in fashion, maybe not, but that this again creates that kind of dialogue and brings people together who may not congregate together otherwise. Yeah.
I want to know your opinion about the professional wear. I always ask myself, because I just got hired in a professional place, Hudson's Bay, and they have this uniform that you have to wear black from head to toe, and you're not allowed to wear open toe shoes. I'm not used to it because I'm a fashion design student. No one can limit me. But I was thinking that
it's called age.
But I was thinking that what would happen if we don't have the code for the professional? I cannot imagine it because it's everywhere. But I'm just always thinking that what would happen if anyone would dress up as the way they want? I'm not saying that go with a bikini to your office, but I'm saying that you would wear what you want to wear, depending on your mood that day, if you found your style or you haven't found your style.
Yeah, I mean, why is a bikini right appropriate for certain bodies on the beach, but if you were to wear it to teach in a class, right? How contextual? What do I think? I mean,
Have you even thought about it?
I think professional wear, I mean, I think it's restrictive, right? I mean, I think that and I think it's professional to whom, right? Like, how has it been taken? Like, who's it actually professional to? Who's it making feel comfortable? And maybe creating some discomfort in professional settings could be a good thing. But I think what it does, I did a talk, I think last year at Harvard Business School. They had a business conference and they asked me to talk about men's wardrobes and like making kind of decisions and how men were, I guess, changing their wardrobe in terms of bringing your whole self to work and thinking through fashion. And part of it was really that for a lot of the men who talked about needing to alter who they were at work by wearing a kind of uniform, whether it was deliberately imposed or not, really meant that they weren't fully bringing their creativity and their ideas and their whole self to work. Nor did they necessarily want to, they were at that job, they liked aspects of the job, it was money, but if they got a chance to jump because they somewhere else valued who they were, they would jump quickly. So from retention, it wasn't good either. So I think the idea is that what do we actually lose by forcing these dress codes? What do we gain, and are the gains even worth it?
What did you wear to that talk?
What did I wear? I wore...
I remember what you wore.
Oh, I wore black, but I wore a black sequin jacket. Yeah.
I'm curious how your participants found the photo shoot and the fashion show experience, and if there was anything surprising from that.
I think for some of, I think first of all, they didn't all participate, right? If I had there were about maybe 50 or so men who took part in the wardrobe interviews, about half took part in the other, in the fashion show and the photo shoots. Of the experience. I think a lot of them, some of them were really excited. Some of them were really nervous. They had never done anything like this before, right? I think for the majority of men, they had never been in any kind of show. They had never sort of, particularly be in a space where they were like being looked at based on their bodies and what they were wearing, right? It wasn't about giving a speech, or it wasn't about right? Like they were being like looked at based on like bodies and clothing. And for some men, like I was like, yeah, I want to do this. And others were like, I don't know. But it was particularly right for the men that felt I knew really uncomfortable. One was like, I thought it was really awesome that they did it. And I think that experience hopefully like also was part of the conversation. But I know getting participants to do the fashion show was a lot more, as particularly for the ones that were quite nervous, was a lot more kind of like labor as a researcher than I thought. There were a lot of phone calls, a lot of meetings, a lot of email exchanges, wanting to ensure people feel confident. Part of me doing it was to make sure I wasn't like, oh, you'll be fine. I'm just gonna sit and clap and like be like, you go. Yeah. I was like, no, I'm gonna do this too. I've also never been in a fashion show. This will also be a new experience for me. It's gonna be but yeah, I think for a lot of them, just being in that space and being just really looked at for their clothing and bodies was completely new. And I think that was uncomfortable, but in a good way.
Would you do it again that way, in terms of having those two sort of creative outputs as research sites?
Yes.
Yeah.
The only thing I would add, and in the extension of this project, if it gets funded, is I've added the clothing, like a fashion hacking method, where I actually want participants either to bring in their own clothing, or we'd get secondhand clothing, and we would over a day cut them up and reassemble them to get ideas of how participants would like to dress. If you could wear what you'd like to wear, let's hack this up, and with support from design students, put it together, and what could that look like? And then that would be part of the fashion show and the shoot. So it wouldn't just be using their wardrobe, but trying to be taking that further. Yeah.
I think to your comments, I probably could add to that from professional experience in retail. many years, but also the fact that I work for a Canadian semi-luxury brand that required black head to toe. I think that's more because you either wear that particular brand's clothing or your clothing shouldn't be branded in any way. So no one should look at you and say, where did you get that dress or top from, if it's not from that particular place. So for example, Holt's Renfrew will give you 50% off, but you gotta wear their clothes and you have a $2,500 limit. Now, who's gonna buy $2,500? Yes, it's 50% off, but if you're working for them unless you could afford it, it's a hard time. So I think, from a retail point of view, it's because they don't want you to be branded. They want you to represent the store. So that's why you're head to toe. But at the store I worked at, we met a manager who said, you also need to wear 6-inch heels. 6? I make my girls wear 6-inch heels. I was like, well, you're not gonna make me wear 6-inch heels because I'm standing for 8 hours straight. But I also realized, talking about this toxic masculinity, I think this sort of goes the other way for women too. And then when I worked in the corporate banking world, I was used to wearing suits and skirts and pencil skirts, whatever. But again, I was wearing them with 6-inch heels sitting behind the desk. No one questioned my gender, apparently. But now, some of my old co-workers or whatever, they see me wearing a suit with men's Oxfords, and all of a sudden people have started questioning my gender. They're actually like, have you, like, is there, I don't know, are you now, because now I dress masculine apparently. And I was just like, just because I'm not wearing heels, it's the same suit. I've worn time and time again. But now you're asking me whether I, like, so I think that sort of goes both ways, but it's, I know men have a much harder time with it. I think really what it points to is how important fashion is. People don't take it serious, because apparently it could change your entire, people's outlook. And when people say it's frivolous, clearly not. Clearly not. If, you've known me for years and now you're questioning.
Should do an MA in fashion or something. No, I think why it's interesting, right? Obviously women have been associated with clothing, the body, appearance, like that's a whole other set of issues. I think, right, with men, because that's been so much in opposition, and because that represents crossing this gender boundary, it then brings up a very just different set of issues, but issues that often aren't, right, at least within research, because of how fashion has been gendered, haven't been really discussed in detail. Yeah.
So, the guys who get a pass, rock stars and celebrities, do you think they have any space? Like, I look at someone like Jared Leto when he's interviewed, just talking about a film, and he'll wear, Gucci's 2017 Bloom. He'll wear like something. He gets a pass. Nobody questions his gender or his sexuality because he's Jared Leto. He's a celebrity. He's an actor. Or, Mick Jagger, if he comes out in a frilly shirt or really tight pants, well, he's a rock star. He gets a pass.
Well, I think you're in the context where if you mobilize femininity, you gain cultural capital. And you also have an enhanced status because you're a man. So you, in fact, you're garnering this, you have this gender privilege that you're just like upping even more because you're seen as being cooler and more creative and more original, and right within these creative spaces for rock stars, for certain actors in fashion, mobilizing femininity garners you cultural capital.
But there's women celebrities that mobilize masculinity too, right? Like Diane Keaton. You could go through the list that they do it in a very similar way. Katharine Hepburn, right? You go through the list like that. Historically has been done too, but at the same time, it's the white female celebrity that tends to be able to do that.
But this
more than anyone else. Queen Latifah, like maybe 91 maybe, but that's a different context.
But that's the point, right? Like
that's a different context.
The man's name that you just took, I have no idea who that is. But I know who Mick Jagger is.
Jared Leto?
What? Yeah. I have no idea who that is. But these men like Mick Jagger and Freddie Mercury and David Bowie, when they did what they did, it was controversial. It's not to this generation.
Yeah, that's
because they've been around a long time. But when Boy George, I was this age in the 80s. So when Boy George and Cyndi Lauper and Annie Lennox and David Bowie, like that was a shocker.
to people. They were like, what is going on here? So now when you're in your 20s and 30s, you're like, oh, well, this guy can perform his whatever. Nobody says anything because people came before them in their professions and established a kind of normalcy that you're allowed to push these boundaries. And before them were the Muhammad Alis who had attitude and, they had this kind of charisma and they had this self-confidence. People didn't talk like he did before he came along, right? So there has been...
Well, they did, but they just didn't like it when it came out of their mouths.
There has been a way that's been paved a little bit for those celebrities to be able to be just accepted the way they are. Because if I had children who would be about 20 or 25 right now, then I lived with Boy George. I accepted David Bowie. I embraced Freddie Mercury when I was at that 18, 20, 25 age. So I would instill that in my children and how I raise them, right? So then it would just be accepted. But at that time, it was like, what are these people doing?
Masculinity at that time was very different too, though, right? Like that was the 80s and the 90s, and it was a much slimmer silhouette. It was very long, rocker hair. It was very feminized, I think.
Well, I mean, there was a lot of things happening in the 80s.
But I mean, just we're talking because what Ben was talking about the silhouette and everything, right? So the 80s and the 90s, it was very much that, like, the big hair on the rocker, but that was male and female, and it was very almost androgynous, but in a way that was...
Yeah, but don't forget Don Johnson.
True.
Who brought in the pink and the baggy pants.
Too, right? Yeah.
When Dynasty's women were wearing very structured, broad-shouldered suits. That's how I launched my career. Was on broad-shouldered, double-breasted suits and pencil skirts, and Don Johnson was wearing these loose, flowing, linen, pink tops, and the women on Dynasty were wearing structured suits. So there was a lot going on. We have a lot to thank for the 80s.
I just think it's like the one thing is like it's always like I'm very mindful of, especially from this, was like it's all about context. So what spaces are like going to the Met Gala or on stage at the ACC is a space where that's expected, or these rock stars have a certain degree of privilege already and power where they're able to do that, or they're in a space that is valorized and like, right, that gives them cultural capital. But like in everyday life, someone couldn't just dress like Bowie even today, and I mean they could, but what are the ramifications then of the subway that like a David Bowie would have never gotten on stage, right? That there's a different set of consequences, and I think so often, in a lot of the work I've done that's looked at men's fashion, it has, even though it's the most obvious like thing, it's negated context and the importance of how context shapes how we dress, even though from like in fashion studies, from a theoretical perspective, it's like, yes, we know like that there's, right, that dress is like situated, like it's based on context, but in many ways research has sort of ignored that like routine thing that actually some space, right, how are we navigating space, and that actually some spaces, right, you can gain privilege by disrupting norms, or it's safe to do that. But do you really make structural changes by dressing in ways in spaces where that's not expected?
And what about like demographic context too? Because even when I was growing up as a kid, I think about like all the guys I knew growing up were very tight clothes when I was a kid, right? Like that was so. And even today, what I see my young students wearing, I'm like, wow, is it today I had a final. I was like, is it 1984 again? Like half my male students literally dressed like they looked like a early 1980s aesthetic, and I thought, wow, that is so amazing because they have no idea that that's right. So that was kind of me feeling old, but then also remembering that context, because for them that is actually that is not 1984. That is a new context. That's today's context for them.
I remember I was in grade 10, and there was a pair of jeans that only women were wearing, and I went out and I got that pair of jeans, and they didn't have a seam on the side.
Was it Buffalo? Were they Buffalo?
They were called Seafarer jeans.
Yes.
And they were just like ordinary jeans, except they didn't have the seam on the side, and they were high-waisted and stuff like that. My God, everybody freaked out that a guy was wearing these jeans.
How'd they feel?
They weren't great.
Yeah.
But it was, but getting back to what you were saying about Paul Renfrew and stuff like that, it was also at that time, that was my first job was at Holt Renfrew, and it was in the high-end couture area. All the women were expected to wear a black top, black skirt, black stockings, black shoes, so that they would basically blend in, so that the customer, whatever they put on, were front and center. So, I know we're talking about masculinity, but it is also a sense of respect for the client.
I kind of don't agree with that, because if I go to a store and I see the workers have a sense of fashion, I'll be like, they probably know something. They can help me.
I
And if
agree.
they just like,
I agree.
I can blend.
But you're a brand too, right? When you go in there, or a museum, it's like an opposite to a museum. You're not going to detract from the artwork. You actually want the art to be up there, right? So you want to make sure that if they can't buy it, like you're buying clothes from Wool, that you're like, I am blend, like I am just blending. So then the art speaks, and I can put you in something that's going to.
And it works in the opposite with her son wearing the brown shoes. He comes in, it's like he doesn't know how to even dress. How does he know about money?
Connotation sometimes more than
Are you still waiting to go?
Well, I think it's funny that I said people question now my gender, but a relationship I had for 10 years, he was really well dressed. He liked patterns, he liked color, he'd do his hair longer than it took me. So when I finally ended the relationship, everyone was like, oh my god, it's because it was gay.
Oh.
And I was like, 10 years.
Oh, they've held that in for 10 years.
I always thought that he probably was. And then I was like, well, no, now he's married. It looks like he's still not gay. But they were just like, and I'm like, you were thinking about this for 10 years? That the man that I was with was gay? And I'm like, I mean, he just looked way too, I mean, you know, he like color and he always looked so put together. And I'm like, just because he looked put together, you associated that with being gay. And I'm just like, it's really sad. So what do you expect men to be? If they're underdressed, you're all sort of like, oh, he's just a bum. Doesn't care. If he's overdressed, he's gay. And I was just like, it's really funny because you didn't question anything. It was just like, he's gay. That's it. That was the only explanation that you could give.
Well, it's like there's these different zones in masculinity, I think men net, right? Like on one hand, you'd be a slob if you're not slow, versus like being too dressed. So where's that ambiguous space in the middle? And it's like not looking put together, but still looking like.
But I think it's also just makes it looks like, even like now that we're talking about it, there's more than just being gay, right? It's just like, if that's it, like finally he's labeled, and they all kind of found out what the problem was after that until they found out he's married, and I'm like, looks like it's not gay. But it's just so sad.
Really, too much time on my hands to read about all this stuff. Did you get a chance to go through the shopping experience with the people in your study as well?
I didn't, really, but that would be.
Because every man that I know that I either help shop or are part of shopping, or they just ask me questions, they're like, I go in, I go out, and that's it. And I don't want to deal with anything, and the hoopla and all the things of malls, and they're just not having it. Now I don't know whether it's interesting to overlay if you had.
I didn't, but I think doing like a go-along interview, whether that's like digitally online and in like store, would be super interesting.
I think part of it too, when we're talking about what's available in the stores, I think a lot of it comes down to we're getting a broader range of male body types as well. And how do we approach that with design students and teaching them how to design for more than just Jimmy? Like you said, beyond the standardized body, it's not available. I have a husband who's 6'5". He explores fashion through bags, shoes, and jackets because that's what's available to him of interest. And my father's what you consider a male plus size. It's a big tent.
Accessibility too, with regards to any disabled.
But we are still teaching students on Jimmy, so how do we get them to start exploring different shapes and fits?
That is a whole other conversation.
Sign me up for that conversation.
Yeah, no, I mean, right, it is a structural change for the industry in terms of, right, holding up a norm that we designed for, and then,
Because I still want to do that block development project.
Yes.
Ben, I was
one of my teams of students did a research on representation of toxic masculinity in television. And what they found is that now kids show are starting to be more open to different representations of masculinity that are more diverse. It's not just like the kid boys wear blue, so there's this male character that wears pink and a belly button that is a bright pink stone, and he has 3 moms who are like goddesses or something. So they have like this whole new perspective on what masculinity is, because nobody's saying that this kid is gay or queer. It's just he's a kid. That's it. Like, there's nothing else to it. It's just a kid wearing a pink t-shirt. There's nothing else to that. But then as they move towards more like young adults and even adults show, then those representations are eliminated. You don't see any diversity in gender, and that is also, you see it in the way that they dress the characters. They dress characters in a very masculine way, and that also reflects their attitudes and behaviors. So I think it's also, we need to pressure media for more representation and for the normalization of different gender experiences, because if they come up with a asexual character, and that's like the highlight of 2017 television, we have an asexual character, and like that was it. And there's, and as well, like they dressed him or her in gray. That was, you know, so there's no real diversity, there's no normalization of different experiences in gender.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting when you look across different like medias in the creative industries and how has this been played out. I mean, I think 2 things. It's like, I think what's sort of stylistic versus like substance. And I think right with fashion, we've seen, oh, look at all the new men's clothing and all this men, like it's changing so much. And is that really like systemic change, or is that just like very surface? And I think it really is a lot of surface, right? You have the one character, or you have like this new thin silhouette, right? But then that's it. And that's seen.
Size 44 chest.
Well, exactly, right? And then that scene where it's like, is that really about, right? And then you have, oh, we have genderless clothing, but it's all masculine. So I still think going back, there is this really anti-femininity and really anti-gay, anti-queer sentiment that drives all of this, because, oh, we embrace everything, but you wouldn't want to look feminine, you wouldn't want to look gay, because that could be, so we're just going to have like gray clothing, or we're just going to have, and I don't think that's really being talked about. I think it's so hidden under this, right, umbrella or this rainbow of like diversity and like the shifts and the industry applauding itself, but really it's still limited to a very narrow people, and ultimately when like big decisions are made, it's still affirming dominance, it's still affirming exclusion, and so that's not real change. But maybe that's a slow start. I don't know.
But culture and television and all those things, those are like the main, I mean, I grew up in the 60s, and, you know, Julia was like a huge
1968,
a black professional woman on television in prime time. That was a huge thing, and it opened up a whole new. So we need, as men in fashion, to start bringing that sort of thing to the forefront, just like in those times, I think.
But do you think it's harder now with there's such a fragmentation of TV, right? Like all the TV, like it's so much harder to have that one central moment that people now.
Great commercials. I actually miss commercials. I don't know if that sounds weird or not,
That
but I
sounds
actually
weird.
miss the break between watching things, or you would go get a drink, or you'd get an apple out of the fridge or something, and that's when I would actually take time to speak to someone. I miss, like now you're watching TV for 40 hours. Like, sitting there like, I have to watch this, I can't finish this, it's gonna be like, it's just a very different experience now, right? And I think you're totally right that we have to embed tokens sometimes or somehow, just so that it starts that conversation.
A conversation.
I miss
Well, are we going to wrap this up soon?
Yeah.
Okay.
Watch standard TV.
And adding to what you said, I think, well, now we really can change that because my generation adapted to social media, and adding to what you said, I feel like if we take this wheel and try to brand ourselves, I think that was one of Ben's lectures last year, that we took, using social media to brand yourself. I feel like if we do that, especially now that a lot of brands are performing on social media, trying to get new customers and stuff. And now my generation has this much awareness of what's happening around us. I feel like if we just keep on doing that, keep on telling people to be confident and do what kind of style they want, I think that would drive these brands to our direction. And have them bring more models that represent us, normal people, than just the thin or the masculine.
Did the men you interviewed, did they have social media profiles where they expressed their fashion?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them did. A lot of it was, I mean, generational. But, I mean, obviously Instagram was a really big tool for a lot of men to showcase, right, in the way they, I mean, some of them coded Instagram, I mean, right, others, right, used it very much as a tool of disruption. And I think fashion, like, as a way to talk back to industry, to put out representations they weren't seeing. And I think certainly in terms of any conversation around inclusion in fashion, social media, like for so many creative industries, but I think particularly for fashion, has been one of the major disruptive forces because, right, it's made this fashion, I mean, it's given a platform for gender non-conforming people, fat people, disabled people to dress how they want to dress and like actually create imagery that they would want to see but they're not seeing and like put themselves out there. And it's really, I think, forced the media to take note, which has forced the industry to take note. And I think it is making, in anything, it sounds really cliche to say social media is a disruptor, but particularly around inclusion in fashion, it's made a big difference. And so it was interesting, like both men who were using social media as a way to sort of just kind of garner like their own status, like my new shoes and this and this, and like, but really the men who's, the racialized men, the fat men, the disabled men, they were like, I'm disrupting like these stereotypes about me and I'm going to be intentional and I'm putting this out to the world because I want this to be there. And that was really interesting to see. And then interesting how that was like, how that lived as a separate way of existing in the world, right, from their real life.
Okay. As a sociologist, which I was once, I was interested in those subtle little things like, because on the one hand, you're sort of deliberately for sort of political reasons, mentioning that there can be real consequences to the fashion choices you make, like you might actually not get a job that you wanted to get, or you might actually get beaten up. But the subtle things are interesting too, aren't they? Like the fact that you might not wear some heels on a subway platform, actually not because something's really going to happen, but just when one person goes, you know, those tiny little things that keep men in line in particular, I think. There was that interesting bit where you said, what if there was a workplace where there were no rules? But like, why is nobody tells the men what to wear. But apart from you marvelous fashion people, then we're all wearing the same boring crap as everybody else, which is interesting. Well, you know, we think about it, but there's not an amazing fashion party that happens just because there's no rules, because there's all these other subtle things about what people worry about, the tiny things. Yeah. The one other thing I wanted to say before we allow you access to the cakes and sandwiches is you started off with this thing. Your question was, can fashion end toxic masculinity?
I don't think I answered it.
I mean, I will.
And having read it on the poster, I thought, well, that seems really unlikely, at least. But at your end bit, you said, everyday actions ignite change, which is a thing I definitely agree with. So then that totally makes sense. So it doesn't it? Through everyday actions, then that's how it can happen. So hooray! Good. So thank you all for coming. That was a great discussion.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming.
I mean, I forgot to ask if there was ever a moment where masculinity wasn't toxic. But that's too loaded a question.
Absolutely.
I mean, that was kind of what I was thinking.
You could be masculine without being toxic. But what happens is it gets recategorized as being feminine. So if you're being supportive,
yeah. So has there been a moment?
Yes, there has. Historically, there has.
Yeah, really. So when was the moment?
In the 18th century, early part of the 18th century, women ran salons.
But was that masculinity equitable?
Equitable?
Meaning, was that for everyone, or were we still talking about a specific, like, Western male kind of defined masculinity?
Well, different cultures have had sort of matriarchal structures where women wore dresses or robes, and there was no sort of policing of women in trousers. It's a really complicated, deep question, but the answer is yes.
And just so you know, heels were worn by Persian men.
Of course.
So I went back and told my brothers, haha, You guys used to wear heels, now, you know, so
Yeah,
yeah.
men wear heels, makeup.
Yes, of course.
The male dandy.
However, if you're enslaved, you don't exactly have a masculinity. That's what I was trying to say.
You should say it. You should say it.
That's just
Disrupt this conversation.
it's just facts.
Keep slamming into you.
It's okay. I feel like yours are big.
But you know what I'm saying?
Alright.
It's a Joel. How can like if you have a whole population that is enslaved, they have no access to masculinity.
Ben, always a pleasure, dude.
Oh, thanks so much for coming.
Absolutely. As soon as I saw that, I was like, oh my god, this is the stuff that I'm reading. Did
Yeah,
you hear
I
about
did.
Michael Kimmel? In the
Yeah,
summer?
I did. And the
Did
chart.
that
I think they're still
punch me-
investigating.
That
I know.
punched me in the gut
I
so
know.
hard because I'm like, dude, you're the poster boy for saying that men have to be different.
I know.
And I
I
thought
know.
maybe it was like one disgruntled, grad student. or whatever,
Yeah.
Just like this.
But I know he'd won a big award by the
Yeah.
American Sociology Association, and then yeah, I know that really I think that rattled.
And that was just after I'd done my defense, and my supervisor was like, oh, by the way, did you hear this? I was like, are you kidding me?
That was so impressive. That was so impressive. Yeah.
I think we just need, one of the things that I thought was really interesting that he put forth was the idea of like masculinity right now is being defined as a subtraction of, you can't be this or that without
Hello.
thing. And there's this war
Back there.
of that.
Yeah.
And that,
Yeah, very random.
Yeah, that's really
I got them from.
He's been thinking about this for a long time. He's contributed to a lot of important work. But yeah, it's a really interesting idea because then the box is so narrow.
I'm a banana bread.
I was saying you want old
Good
banana.
stuff.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
For sure. And Tanya, when I come here, she just got pulled onto a video today.
No problem.
She sends.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Common ground says you're busy, but now I know that it doesn't necessarily mean
There's all things that you wouldn't do if you were going to meetings.
In the
I would love to see you add some in email and
It's not just really it's like a cross. Yeah. But again, it's like, are there the real question is, are there
really nice
moments
too that were like.
I think when
Oh, yeah, that's exactly Louis saying that thing.
Yes.
like it just gets something body.
Well, just a scene.
I'm wearing a lot of hats next year.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great to know.
Yeah. I'm not sure yet where some proposals that I submitted to
Yeah, I'll definitely think about that. I think that would be
mainly just creative spaces for Toronto. But if I can maybe just set that up. I don't know if you're going to do a
I mean, it's the same thing, and then I pointed over.
No, I loved it. I loved what you were to say.
Yeah, mainly
Oh, well,
just to
yeah.
block your dates, yes.
Okay.
Well,